In this module, we're going to cover the basics of ASP.NET 5 as a platform. Through the course of this module, we're going to be giving you the understanding of what the ASP.NET 5 platform is, what the component parts are, and we're going to show you how to create the base of our project. We're actually not going to get into any coding in this module, but we'll show you where all the frameworks live, what the different versions of ASP.NET 5 you can use, as well as what platforms it can run on. So the first important question here is, why should we be reinventing ASP.NET anyway? The web stack that ASP.NET is based on is actually pretty old, started back in .NET 1.0. ASP.NET is weighed down by a lot of the unused code in the .NET framework. Since it's been around since .NET 1, there's a lot of old code and legacy code that it has been stuck and entrenched in having to load even when it wasn't being used. The biggest piece of this is System.web. System.web was the linkage between the old ASP.NET and what ASP.NET MVC and Web API were trying to do in freeing themselves from that. You saw some hints of this in the way that ASP.NET MVC and Web API wanted to support things like self-hosting. But in all these cases, it was still being tied to the Windows platform on IIS. When an application lived on a set of servers that needed .NET to be updated, because all of these depended on machine-level versions of .NET, it became problematic to retest and verify that there weren't any new bugs that new versions of .NET were introducing. There's no way to isolate the version of .NET to your application so that your application could continue to load without having to necessarily use a newer version of the .NET framework. This way you can make the choice of whether to leave it in isolation or bring it in. And the ASP.NET team had gotten to the point where they had eked out as much performance as they could with the existing platform. This was especially true of a cold boot, or starting up of a web server all the way to that first request being successfully delivered. That time frame was hampered by the amount of code that had to be loaded in, compiled, written to disk, loaded back into memory, and then executed. Something had to change. To be very clear, ASP.NET is a rethinking from the ground up. There's nothing in ASP.NET except concepts that were brought over. And you'll see as we look at what ASP.NET is actually composed of, that a lot of the things you may have come to be familiar with are gone or changed, and for the most part, that is for the better. As we show you what ASP.NET 5 is composed of and how it's hosted, you'll see this is incredibly different from every other version of ASP.NET. There was even some discussion of not calling it ASP.NET because the changes are that dramatic.